A very brief preamble about JASIST, of which I am editor-in-chief. It's been around and published continuously for 66 years. It's one of the longest continuously published journals in the world in our field. It has, like many other journals, had a few name changes in the course of its natural evolution. It began life in 1950 as American Documentation, and last year as the ASIS, which was the American Society for Information Science and Technology, decided to no longer be American but to be global. Its title changed yet again to Journal of the Association for Information Science and Technology. The journal welcomes, he says, rigorous work, but it can be of many, many different kinds. We're not just experimental, we're not just empirical, we're not just survey-based, we're not just theoretical. We welcome any work that is rigorous. Now, having said that, of course, not everything we publish is as rigorous as one might like. That is a fact of life. But the goal is to be demanding, to be challenging, and we have a really rather high rejection rate, and that is important to maintain. Some very elementary statistics, just to give you a sense of the amount of work and activity that's involved in editing a journal. It's trivial, by the way, in comparison to a journal like Nature, but it's very significant in our field. It probably is, in terms of general coverage, it is by far not only the best, and I don't say that just because I'm the editor, it is not only the best, but the widest ranging and largest journal of its kind. We receive about 800 submissions in a year, and 80% of those come from outside the United States. I think that's important to remember. So perhaps the name change was significant after all and appropriate. Of those, I look at every single manuscript that arrives, and I reject typically 55 to 60% of all manuscripts. That's a desk reject. They do not go out to external review. We use single blind, which has its supporters and which has its detractors, as does double blind, as does open peer review, detractors, and those who are supporters. I won't express an opinion. We try to be very quick in turnaround time. We're not very quick in terms of getting it to market, i.e. finally published, but that's a publisher problem, not an editorial problem. We typically, I'm looking at all the data I have, we will return referees, comments to, and have made a decision within 2 months, which is pretty quick. A typical paper submitted to JASIST will have been reviewed by, on average, 2.5 external reviewers. And Thomas made the point that a great deal of invisible work is involved in editing a journal, and that is true. Typically, I will have to write to, more than once in most cases, in excess of 1,000 reviewers in the course of a year in order to generate enough positive reviews to move ahead with the submissions that we do actually look at. JASIST is published every month on time, and in the course of a year, it amounts to about 2,500 pages. That's a very, very significant amount of work. The data that Wiley, the publisher, provided me with most recently, we have something like 300,000 full-text accesses, 1 million page views, impact factor, and I am not an impact factor supporter, and I would prefer not to have it stated on the journal's webpage, but publishers are publishers, and they insist, is 2.23. I have no interest in tweeting, thus we only have 1,000 Twitter followers. This gives you a sense of where the manuscripts come from. We don't have a breakdown, so I can't tell you how many actually come from Catalonia, but from Spain, a growing and significant number of manuscripts. The United States, as I said, accounts for a relatively modest number of manuscripts. Countries like China and Brazil are growing quite significantly. This is a very, very interesting little quotation from Peter Suber, one of the great advocates of open access, by the way. Now, I'm going to say that JASIST is a prestigious journal, not because I'm the editor. I thought that before I was the editor, and after I'm editor, I will probably continue to think the same thing. And he says, a journal needs excellent submissions in order to generate prestige, to become prestigious. People refer to you as a prestigious and important journal. But to attract those excellent manuscripts, you have to be prestigious. So which comes first? Unfortunately, as I say, in our field at least, JASIST has prestige, so it makes it easier. Authors want to publish in JASIST because it has a reputation. Suppose you start a journal tomorrow, Ernest, another one. How do you begin to attract excellent papers from the best-known authors? It's going to be very, very difficult. But rather interestingly, Public Library of Science, particularly PLOS One, which is the general journal, has become the fastest growing journal in the history of publication, accounting for, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 30% of all currently published science, technology, and medical papers. That's an astonishing achievement in a very, very short time. PLOS One was not a competitor of JASIST a decade ago, and now authors who previously might have first submitted their manuscript to JASIST will submit it to PLOS One. And that's a lovely example of a journal that had zero prestige, it didn't exist, but very quickly started to attract excellent manuscripts. What do academics do? Well, you say they teach, they write, they do research, but what they're really doing is accumulating symbolic capital, i.e. making themselves better known, because the better known you are, the easier it is if you have status, if you have reputation, if you have prestige, if you have access to resources and grant money, and if you have institutional or professional or societal power, you can do a lot more. It's easier to get published. And of course, the more often you get published, particularly in the better journals, the more symbolic capital you generate, which in turn increases your status, your reputation, your prestige, and you have a virtuous circle. So publication matters unto those who hath shall be given, the Matthew law to which Thomas referred a moment ago. Now, whether it's JASIST or Library Quarterly or BED or Revista, it doesn't matter. Editors make mistakes, and editors sometimes get things right. And the editor's dilemma I've learned over the year is we receive what is, in fact, a good paper, but for one reason or another, I or the referees and I decide to reject it. That's what we call a type 1 error in research terms. On the other hand, sometimes we receive a paper that is frankly bad, but we didn't notice it was bad, or we didn't see through it, and we publish it. So this is a dilemma. How many good papers do we turn away, and how many bad papers get through the system? I won't answer the question. Drummond Rennie is a doctor, medical doctor, and he's one of the senior associate editor of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And in the light of Thomas's remarks about peer review, this is perhaps pertinent. Remember, he's a doctor, and he says if peer review is a drug, pharmaceutical drug, it simply would not be allowed onto the market. Why? It's a liability. And we have done meta-analyses ourselves of peer review and bias in peer review. And despite all the commentary, it's not clear whether there is anything better than the existing model, though there are many, many people, a growing number of people, who would actually scrap the system because it is enormously time-intensive, enormously expensive. Thousands of people spend thousands of hours every day of the week, voluntarily in most cases, generating reviews for journals. And there is not a great deal of empirical evidence to suggest that external reviews add greatly to the quality of the article or prevent, and this is very important, or prevent erroneous or false or dubious research from being published, even in the most important, significant journals. The world is changing, as you've heard throughout this conference. We don't just publish journal articles, and many scholars produce many, many different kinds of outputs. And those outputs are subjected to peer review of different levels of intensity. Sometimes it's very light or almost non-existent, and other times it's very robust. If you've published in Nature, as I have, it goes through a very, very rigorous, I can assure you, review process, very demanding. On the other hand, different kinds of outputs have different degrees of scholarly substance. Some are lightweight, some are seriously heavyweight. And all I'm trying to do here is to illustrate how today the contemporary scholar generates a multiplicity of outputs of different kinds, of different scholarly heft, which undergo differential kinds of peer review, ranging from an article published in Nature itself, or Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, or Scientific American, whatever it might be, Journal of the American Medical Association, right down to tweeting, which doesn't have to undergo any kind of peer review, but there is a growing interest in scientific and scholarly tweeting and scientific and scholarly blogging. These are important correlatives, complementary approaches to scholarly publishing, but they're not all subject to the same kind of peer review. Again, as Thomas and others have said, authors want to see what their footprint is like, not just that they published in a particular journal, but where have they been cited? In Scopus, in PMC, PubMed Central. Where are their works being discussed? Who's loading their papers onto Mendeley and such like? And now, this is just the kind of output you get if you've published in PLOS One. It shows you, if you like, the dynamic, ongoing, real-time impact of your research work. In 2001, I coined the term hyper-authorship. It's mentioned actually last week in an article in Nature. Nature wrote a piece, as did several other journals, about a paper that was published in High Energy Physics a couple of weeks ago with 5,000 and something authors. That's apparently a world record for co-authorship, massive authorship. And I coined hyper-authorship to capture this sense of not just co-authorship, 5, 6 co-authors, but literally hundreds and sometimes thousands of co-authors. And what we're seeing is, in the old days, the author was an individual or one or two people, very few hands. And what an author produced was primarily text, a document, a manuscript, a book chapter, a scholarly article. But today, it can be an enormous data set. It can include software. It can include dynamic visualizations, etc., etc. So the more hands taking part in a research project, the more likely are the contributions to go way beyond just the generation, the production of words and text. And that is what I'm trying to get at with hyper-authorship. And here are some data just to demonstrate how dramatic this trend is in some fields. High energy physics is the poster child. Another area is biomedical research and things like clinical studies, for example. The very bottom line, the pale blue line, is the number of papers published in Web of Science that have 1,000 or more authors, and it's increasing. And at the top, the baby, the number of papers that have 50 or more authors, that's more than 1,000. So co-authorship, even extreme authorship, is one of the facts of contemporary scholarly life. These data are very similar to the data we saw earlier this on from Cristobal and Jordi. If you look at the lighter colored squares, that's the first of all, by the way, this is all the literature of library and information science from the year 1900 to about 2000, I think it was 12 in our study, 2011. So we looked at all publications in LIS literature over the course of a century. And what we found was that the average number of authors rose, as you might imagine, from 1 in the beginning, and stayed at 1 for decade after decade. And then around about the 1990s, the mid-1990s, you get a spike. You get a quite dramatic upward increase in the number of co-authors. And the darker squares here indicate the percentage of articles published in the literature of our ill-defined and ill-described field, the number of articles that actually are co-authored. And today, you could estimate that something like 65 to 70% of all articles published in the literature, however you define it, library and information science, will be co-authored. A general observation. When I started writing 40 years ago, I wrote as an individual, a sole author. What I wrote were text, lots of words, punctuation marks. They had narrative, a beginning, a middle and end, an introduction, methods, description of results, and so on. It was very much a craft activity. Today, the sole author is almost a dying species, almost an anachronism in some fields. And everything is a function of collaboration, large-scale collaboration, and the whole idea of what's called fractionalized authorship. There is no longer an author. If there are 5,000 individuals, who wrote each word? It's simply not possible. What is required is that we reconceptualize authorship, and one of the terms that's frequently used is contributorship. Who contributed what to this piece of work? It could be software, it could be data analysis, it could be verification, it could be manuscript drafting, etc., etc., etc. And the texts that are produced today, as you see on the right-hand side, are often very data-rich, data-intensive. They might include an animation. The text itself may undergo real-time versioning, and software and supplementary data sets are included. Now, this comes at a cost sometimes. The more authors you have on a paper, the less not only emotional equity, but the less commitment individuals have to that piece of work. If there are 500 authors, do each of them genuinely believe that that is their piece of work? And as you spread accountability across a larger and larger population of authors, it's harder to ensure trust it's harder to be certain that there is no fraud, that no error has been introduced. And if you are to look at data, and there's widely published data on rates and levels of retraction in mainstream scientific journals, including the natures of this world, what we find is that in the competitive world of contemporary science, a world in which co-authorship is the norm, there is increasing evidence that fraud and error are being perpetuated. Foucault, writing in the I think it was 1970 or 80, talked about the author function. Well, growing up, to me, an author was very simple. It was the person who held the pen and wrote the piece of work. It was the person who typed it on an electronic typewriter. And today it's the person on a word processing machine. But in fact, there's much more. You have the author, if there is such a thing, but you have 1, 2, 5 to n co-authors. And then it's realized that in something like 5 to 15% of all papers published in, for example, biomedical research, that something called gift or ghost authorship occurs. Gift authorship is giving my colleague Giovanni, putting his name up because he's a friend or something. He's not really an author, but he gets the credit. The obverse of that is ghost authorship, where you work as my research assistant, do much of the work, but I publish the paper in my name and you don't get a byline. You're not mentioned as a co-author. Now, if you're very lucky, I might mention you in the acknowledgement. You might get nothing at all. This is a much more common occurrence. It's documented in survey work. Both of these phenomena than you might think. And then there's a whole world, the very murky, the very grey, the very ethically dubious world of large pharmaceutical companies hiring academics, respectable scientists and researchers, to put their name on studies that are actually conducted by the drug companies themselves. That's what's called co-opted authorship. And then a phrase that I've used but did not coin, sub-authorship collaboration. And that's the acknowledgement in scholarly articles that identifies all the other individuals, your trusted peers, your friends, your colleagues, your technicians, who contributed to the work and who often are named for the contributions they made. It's a very grey area whether somebody should be named in the acknowledgement or should be listed as a co-author. That just gives you, and this is just an article at random on early stage breast cancer. What it does, it lists the various elements of the study, who conceived and designed the study, and then it lists the relevant co-authors. Who was responsible for data acquisition, and then it lists those individuals. Who was involved in analysis, interpretation, and then the names, and so on. Who obtained the funding? Who supervised the study? Very important. Is there somebody who can act as a guarantor for this research in the event of it being challenged on grounds of statistical, inferential statistics, method, sample reliability, etc., etc.? And I'm almost finished. The Wellcome Trust right now has literally in the last week or two has produced a template, an attempt to create a standardized way of recording all the contributions that make up the production of a scientific article. Instead of just saying the authors are Giovanni and Blaise and Thomas and Elke and so on, we will actually itemize who did what. And I'll finish with a reflection on the last 7 years of editing JASIST. And I've been editing ARIST, the Annual Review of Information Science and Technology, for 10 years before that. And I've founded a journal, and I've been editing journals for 30, 40 years. And these are my conclusions. That the current competitive nature of scholarly research and scientific research is putting enormous pressures on authors. And that pressure is being pushed in turn onto editors. I find that authors, and I'm generalizing, and I have to be very careful, are frequently guilty of cutting corners, rushing into print, and that the quality of writing, I am not talking about people writing in English as a second language, I'm talking about native English speakers, sloppy, low-quality writing, clearly haven't thought through, so desperate to publish that they won't spend time refining and polishing. Salami slicing, nothing new, but I think a lot more sausages are being cut these days than ever before. LPU simply means least publishable unit. A study is done, and the number of papers produced in that study is, in my mind, often unethical. I notice a very convenient failure on the part of authors submitting to JASIST to forget to mention that they themselves published related work somewhere else. Now, normally authors are very keen to self-cite, But if it's going to affect their getting published, well, they'll overlook the fact that they published very similar work in a conference somewhere else. When I'm working as editor, I sit with two screens. And the manuscript in front of me, I go searching, and then I look for similar manuscript by those authors. And I go through it line by line. Elke was saying that her journal, that they use plagiarism detective. My publisher doesn't do that, but I would recommend it. And the last thing that I've noticed is a growing impatience on the part of authors. They've become much more demanding, and there's been a decline in civility in correspondence and my interactions with authors. And last year, I had 2 cases involving physicists from 2 nameless European countries, which involved lawyers and threats of legal action. And it really is quite remarkable that scholarly publishing has got to the point where authors who are aggrieved, without cause, I would argue in every case, have to result to threats of lawyers and legal action and litigation to get published. Thank you.